Imagine for a moment that every city you've ever known, every bank, every port, every library, and every seat of government simply ceased to function in the span of a single human lifetime. Imagine that the global trade routes we rely on for everything from fuel to food were suddenly cut, not by a single war, but by a cascade of disasters so absolute that the very art of writing was forgotten for 400 years. This isn't a pitch for a dystopian novel or a vision of a far-off future. It is a cold, hard fact of our collective past. 3,000 years ago, the Mediterranean world was more like our own than we often care to admit. It was a sophisticated, hyper-connected web of superpowers that had spent centuries building a golden age of art, diplomacy, and commerce. Then, in the blink of an archaeological eye, it all vanished. The palaces were burned to the ground. The great kings were silenced, and the world plummeted into a deep, terrifying darkness. We call it the Bronze Age collapse, and for decades it has been the greatest whodunit in human history. To understand the scale of the tragedy, you have to understand what was lost. In the year 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a theater of giants. In the north, the Mycenaean Greeks were building the massive stone citadels that would later inspire the legends of the Trojan War. To the east, the Hittite Empire ruled the rugged highlands of modern-day Turkey with an iron fist and a legendary chariot course. To the south, Egypt was at the height of its new kingdom glory under the pharaohs, while the wealthy city-states of Canaan and Syria acted as the world's first true international hubs. These nations weren't isolated islands, they were part of a delicate globalized economy. They traded in gold, ivory, linen, and exotic oils, but their entire civilization rested on a single, vital commodity: bronze. Bronze was the oil of the ancient world. It was the high-tech material used for everything from heavy-duty tools to the armor and weapons that kept empires secure. But to make bronze, you need two things that are rarely found together: copper and tin. Copper was plentiful on the island of Cyprus, but tin was a different story. To get the tin required for their weapons, the kings of Egypt and Mesopotamia had to trade with partners as far away as the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan or the edges of Western Europe. This meant that the survival of a kingdom in Greece depended on the stability of a trade route thousands of miles away. It was a beautiful, efficient, and incredibly fragile system of interdependence. Then, around 1177 BCE, the lights began to go out. The evidence is etched into the very soil of the Mediterranean, found in what archaeologists call burn layers. At site after site, from the coast of Syria to the heart of the Greek mainland, researchers have uncovered thick blankets of ash and charcoal buried beneath the earth. These layers represent the final, violent moments of cities that had stood for centuries. In many cases, these cities were never rebuilt. They were simply abandoned to the wind and the dust. Among the ruins, we find the desperate final words of a dying world. In the city of Ugarit, on the coast of modern-day Syria, archaeologists discovered a clay tablet still sitting in a kiln, as if the scribe had just stepped away for a moment. It is a letter from the king of Ugarit to a neighboring monarch, and it reads like a frantic cry for help. He writes that the enemy's ships are here, that his own troops are far away, and that his cities have already been set on fire. The letter was never sent. The enemy arrived before the clay could even dry. For a long time, historians blamed this destruction on a mysterious group of invaders known as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian temple walls depict great naval battles against these marauders, showing them as a chaotic tide of warriors wearing feathered headdresses and horned helmets. The narrative was simple. A barbarian horde swept in from the sea and burned the civilized world to the ground. But as our scientific tools have improved, we've realized that the Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it. The real story is far more complex and far more haunting. Recent climate data gathered from ancient pollen samples and stalagmites in deep caves has revealed a terrifying truth. The collapse coincided with a megadrought that lasted for over a century. Imagine the Mediterranean, usually a land of plenty, suddenly turning into a dust bowl. Year after year, the rains failed. The crops withered in the fields, and the granaries ran empty. In a world where the king's primary job was to ensure the food supply, the people began to lose faith in the gods and their rulers. As the famine took hold, the system began to fail. We now call this a systemic collapse, where multiple stresses hit a society all at once. It wasn't just the drought. During this same window, a phenomenon known as an earthquake storm struck the region, a series of massive seismic events that leveled palaces and cracked city walls, making them defenseless. With the food gone and the walls down, the peasants likely revolted against the elites who could no longer protect them. This internal chaos created a power vacuum. The Sea Peoples were likely not a single invading army, but a desperate mass of refugees and displaced warriors, driven from their own homes by the same famine and war. They were moving across the Mediterranean like a slow-moving forest fire, looking for food and land. When they hit the already weakened empires of the Bronze Age, the entire structure buckled. Because the kingdoms were so interconnected, when one pillar fell, it pulled the others down with it. The most surprising discovery of recent years is just how total the erasure was. When the Mycenaean palaces in Greece burned, the art of writing a complex script called Linear B vanished entirely. The people who lived in the ruins of those palaces 100 years later had no idea who had built them. They believed the massive stone walls must have been the work of one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes. They lost their history, their tax records, and their literature. They entered a dark age that lasted for 4 centuries, living in small isolated villages, completely cut off from the ghost world of their ancestors. The bigger implication of the Bronze Age collapse is a sobering mirror for our own time. We often think of progress as a one-way street, an inevitable climb toward greater complexity and technology. But history shows us that civilization is not a foundation. It is a performance. It is something that must be maintained every single day through trade, diplomacy, and the stable management of resources. The Bronze Age Greeks and Hittites were just as smart, just as ambitious, and just as modern as we are in their own context. They believed their world was too big, too connected, and too powerful to ever truly fail. Yet, they learned the hard way that complexity is a double-edged sword. The same trade networks that brought them unimaginable wealth also made them vulnerable to shocks happening on the other side of the horizon. When the climate shifted and the supply chain snapped, their sophisticated world didn't just bend, it shattered. They were victims of a perfect storm of disasters that no single kingdom could survive on its own. Today, we walk through the ruins of these great empires as tourists, marveling at the scale of their ambition. We look at the pyramids or the Lion Gate of Mycenae and feel a sense of distant wonder. But the real lesson of the Bronze Age isn't found in the stones they left behind. It's found in the silence that followed. It is a reminder that the thin veneer of civilization is held together by 1,000 invisible threads, and that when those threads begin to fray, the fall can be faster and more final than we ever dared to imagine. The collapse was not the end of the human story, of course. Eventually, out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age was born. New cultures emerged, like the Phoenicians and the Greeks of the classical era, who gave us the alphabet and the foundations of democracy. But that rebirth took hundreds of years of suffering and forgetting. As we look at our own hyper-connected, climate-strained world, the story of 1177 BCE serves as a haunting whisper from the past. It tells us that no matter how great the empire, no matter how vast the trade, we are always just a few failed harvests away from the dark.